Caitlin Clark, all right? The Indiana Fever star was named Time Magazine's Athlete of the Year earlier this week, and she took time to acknowledge that race played a role in her success this year.
They called her privileged. They said she didn't deserve it. But when Caitlin Clark spoke her truth about race in the WNBA, everything changed.
You see why I had no problem with her being Time's Athlete of the Year? You see why I said that she should have been on Team USA? You see why I had to go off on the likes of Cheryl Swoops and others who were clearly distant and dismissed.
Caitlin Clark Allwright, the Indiana Fever star, was named Time Magazine's Athlete of the Year earlier this week, and she took time to acknowledge that race played a role in her success this year. They called her privileged. They said she didn't deserve it, but when Caitlin Clark spoke her truth about race in the WNBA, everything changed. You see why I had no problem with her being Time's Athlete of the Year. You see why I said that she should have been on Team USA. You see why I had to go off on the likes of Cheryl Swoops and others who were clearly distant and dismissive of her. No matter now, Stephen A. Smith is unleashing hell on her critics. The real shocker: Clark just achieved what the WNBA couldn't do in 22 years. This story isn't just about basketball. It's about power change and who really controls women's sports. So check this out. We're diving into something that's got the entire sports world buzzing right now. Caitlin Clark, the biggest name in women's basketball, just dropped a truth bomb in Time Magazine that's sending shockwaves through the industry, and who's stepping up to defend her none other than Stephen A. Smith himself. But man, this story goes way deeper than just another sport controversy. This year, here's a passage from the article in Times Magazine. Quote, "I want to say I've earned every single thing. But as a white person, there's privilege. A lot of those players in the league that have been really good have been black players. This league has been being built on them. The more we can appreciate that, highlight that, talk about that, I think it's very important. I have to continue to try to change that. The more we can elevate black women, that's going to be a me breakdown exactly what happened, because this is where things get really interesting." Clark, you know, the same player who's been breaking records left and right. She got named Time Magazine's Athlete of the Year. Now most athletes would just take that W and run with it, but not Clark. Instead, she did something that caught everybody off guard. She straight up acknowledged her white privilege in women's basketball. Here's what's wild about this whole situation. When Clark talked about her privilege, she wasn't just checking a box or playing politics. She specifically pointed out how black players built the WNBA from the ground up. And let me tell you, that acknowledgement, that hit different. She basically said, look, I know I work hard, but I also know there are some advantages I've had that others didn't. Caitlin Clark hasn't spoken to anybody. She hasn't assisted in denying anybody else the privileges they deserve. If anything, she's tried to provide assistance. Now, you'd think people would respect that kind of honesty, right? But now that's not how it played out. Some folks in the WNBA community were talking legends like Cheryl Swoops. They started throwing shade. And this is where Stephen A. Smith comes in like a hurricane, because let me tell you something, when Stephen A. gets fired up about something, you better believe has got receipts. Tried to deny it. There was resentment towards her, and here's why I said it was stupid. Because when she came into the WNBA for 22 plus years, they had been flying commercial. They were begging for shade flight. She arrives there, and 2 weeks later, they got steep and pointed out something that nobody else was talking about before. Clark even played her first WNBA game before she even suited up for the Indiana Fever. She already changed the game. You want to know how? For 22 years, let that sink in. 22 years, WNBA players have been begging for chartered flights. They were out here flying commercial, dealing with delays, connections, all that mess. And Clark shows up, and boom, 2 weeks later, they got those chartered flights, and people were resenting her for it, like she was the cause of the problems that they had for the lack of recognition. No, she just happened to be born white. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Some people in the WNBA community started resenting Clark for this, and Stephen A. wasn't having any of it. He broke it down like this: how are you going to be mad at someone who's actually improving your working conditions? That's like being angry at the person who got you AR raised just because they are new to the company. Let's talk numbers for a second, because this is where Step A's argument gets even stronger since Clark entered the picture. Attendance at Indiana Fever games has skyrocketed, TV ratings through the roof, the WNBA draft on ABC and ESPN breaking records left and right. Now, Stephen A. made it clear, yes, the WNBA is still losing money compared to what they like to be earning, but for the first time in a long time, that trajectory is pointing up. This is where Stephen A. really showed why he's one of the most respected voices in sports media. He drew a parallel that nobody else was making. He compared the situation to the civil rights era, pointing out how during those struggles, black leaders didn't reject white allies who marched with them. They welcomed them. Because guess what? When you're fighting for progress, you don't push away people who are trying to help lift everyone up the way. Stephen sees it. And this is crucially, anger is misplaced. If you're going to be mad at the system that's been holding women's basketball back all these years. Be mad at the corporate structures that didn't give the WNBA the recognition it deserved. Be mad at the decision makers who denied these athletes proper compensation. and working conditions for decades. But don't be mad at Caitlin Clark, because here's the thing about Clark, and this is what Stephen A. kept hammering home: she hasn't spoken against anybody. She hasn't tried to take credit away from the pioneers who built this league. If anything, she's doing the exact opposite. She's using her platform to highlight the contributions of black players who came before her. She's acknowledging her privilege while actively working to make things better for everyone. And the league think about it like this: when you've got someone with influence who's actually trying to help your cause, why would you push them away? As Stephen A. put it, a rising tide lifts all boats. Clark isn't just rising by herself, she's trying to bring the whole league up with her. And that's what makes this whole controversy so frustrating for people like Stephen A. Smith. But here's where things get even more interesting, and this is something Stephen A. really emphasizing. His response: we're not just talking about basketball anymore, we're talking about a fundamental shift in how we view progress in women's sports. And let me tell you why this matters so much. Stephen pointed out something that a lot of people miss in this whole controversy. When Clark acknowledged her privilege, she wasn't just making a statement, she was opening up a conversation that the WNBA has needed to have for years. Think about it: how many athletes in her position would have just taken the acclaim and kept quiet? But that's not what she did. Let's dig deeper into what Stephen A. was really getting at. He brought up how for years the WNBA has been fighting for basic respect in the sports world. We're talking about things that NBA players take for granted: decent travel conditions, fair pay, media coverage. And what's wild is that it took someone like Clark, who openly acknowledges her privilege, to finally start moving the needle on these issues. But Stephen A. wasn't done there. He started breaking down why some of the criticism aimed at Clark was not just unfair, but straight-up counterproductive. Here's a player who's bringing unprecedented attention to the league. The numbers don't lie. We're seeing record-breaking viewership, sold-out arenas, and more media coverage than ever before. And instead of celebrating this momentum, some folks are acting like it's a bad thing just because of who's bringing it. Stephen made this brilliant point about how progress actually works in sports. He said, you don't get to choose how positive change comes. What matters is what you do with it when it arrives. And that's exactly what's happening here. Clark's success isn't taking anything away from the amazing black athletes who built this league. If anything, she's using her platform to amplify their voices and their contributions. Here's another angle that Stephen explored, and this is crucial. He talked about how some people in the WNBA community are so focused on who's bringing the change that they're missing the bigger picture. The league is finally getting some of the things it's been fighting for: better travel conditions, more media coverage, bigger crowds. Isn't that what everyone's been working toward? But let's talk about something that Stephen really drove home: the importance of unity in making real change. He pointed out how historically successful movements for equality haven't succeeded by rejecting allies. They succeeded by building coalitions, by bringing together people from different background who share the same goals. And that's exactly what Clark is trying to do. Think about this for a second. And this is something Stephen A. emphasized repeatedly. When Clark talks about her privilege, she's not just making a passive acknowledgement. She's actively using her platform to highlight the contributions of black players who built the WNBA. She's talking about the importance of elevating black women in the sport. That's not taking away from anyone's legacy, that's adding to it. Stephen A. also addressed this idea that somehow Clark's success diminishes the achievement of others. He called it out for what it is: a false narrative. Success in women's sports isn't a zero-sum game. Clark drawing more attention to the WNBA doesn't take away from the incredible achievement of players like Cheryl Swoops, Lisa Leslie, or Dawn Staley. If anything, it brings more attention to their legacies. And here's where Stephen really hit the nail on the head. He talked about how the real enemy isn't other players, it's the systemic barriers that have held women's basketball back for decades. A real fight isn't against someone like Clark who's trying to help break down those barriers. A real fight is against the structures and attitudes that made those barriers necessary in the first place. Let's be real about something else. Stephen pointed out the timing of all this. The WNBA is at a crucial moment in its history. It's finally getting some of the recognition and resources it deserves. Television ratings are up, attendance is growing, sponsorship deals are getting better. This is exactly what everyone's been fighting for. So why are some people acting like this success is a problem just because of who's helping to drive it? Stephen wrapped up his defense of Clark with his powerful point about legacy. He said that years from now, people aren't going to remember the controversy. They're going to remember this is a moment when women's basketball finally started getting the respect it deserved. They are going to remember how a player used her privilege not to exclude others, but to lift them up. And that's really what this whole situation comes down to. It's not just about Caitlin Clark or Stephen Smith or even the WNBA. It's about understanding that progress doesn't always come in the package we expect. Sometimes it comes through unlikely allies. Sometimes it comes through people who acknowledge their advantages and use them to help others. And as Steph A. Smith so eloquently put it, that's Not something we should resist, it's something we should embrace, because at the end of the day, this isn't just about basketball, it's about recognizing that real change happens when people come together, when they acknowledge their differences but work toward common goals. And that's exactly what Clark is trying to do, use her platform to make things better for everyone in the game, not just herself. So the next time someone tries to make this about race or privilege, or who deserves what, remember what Stephen A. Smith said, remember that the real measure of progress isn't who brings it, it's what we do with it when it arrives. And right now, women's basketball is a chance to do something extraordinary. Let's not waste it by fighting the wrong battles. And here's something else that Stephen brought up, that we really need to talk about the long-term impact of this whole situation, because what's happening right now isn't just about one player or one season we're watching. A fundamental shift in how women's sports are perceived, marketed, and supported. Think about what Stephen A. said about the business side of things. Before, Clark trying to get major sponsors interested in the WNBA was like pulling teeth, but now companies are lining up, they're seeing the potential that's always been there. And yeah, maybe it took someone like Clark to open those doors, but guess what? Once those doors are open, they're open for everybody. Stephen A. made this brilliant comparison that really puts things in perspective. He talked about how in business, when a new employee comes in and gets a company